Hi, everybody, and welcome to this ValuesJam guest series session. And Ruth, it's great to have you with us. So to kick off, introduce yourself, please, and tell us about the great work that you do.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for having me. A bit about me. So I split my time between two different kind of types of work, I suppose. So half the week I spend with the Common Cause Foundation, who work specifically on social and environmental change, thinking about it from the perspective of the social psychology of values. So we draw on lots of kind of academic psychology practice, and we think about how that translates into the field of change making in its kind of broadest sense. And for them, we're a really tiny team, so I do a bit of everything for them, which I love. But I focus quite a bit on our kind of learning program. So how do we motivate people to think about values in terms of change making, and how do we kind of take what I consider to be a super interesting body of research and make that really engaging and accessible to a wider audience? So that's half my week, and the other half I freelance, mainly doing narrative strategy. So thinking about the very big kind of cultural stories that we're all surrounded by all the time in our lives, thinking about the really deep values and beliefs that are found at the center of those narratives, and thinking about what would the world look like, or what kind of possibilities might become available to us if we shifted some of those narratives, if we thought really consciously about the types of values, the types of beliefs that we wanted to center and foreground in the way that we kind of build our world and how we live together. So both really centered on values. It's become a really huge theme and part of my work and life, but yeah, from two slightly different angles, which for me just brings constant like new sources of inspiration.
Wow. Now, before we get into the Values Jam, you're making me wonder, and I've got a question for you, because what you've described strikes me as being really a beautiful, optimistic area to work in on the one hand,
Mhm.
but then quite pessimistic in a way, because it's like, how is there so much mess in the world at the same time?
Mm.
So does that land with you? How
Oh,
do you
absolutely.
visualize that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I probably flip between those two extremes 15 times a day. I think I naturally fall somewhere in the middle. I can have optimistic days and pessimistic days. Um, I also feel very strongly that the scale of mess in the world requires an equally ambitious and bold and courageous type of change
Yeah,
process, I suppose. Um, and a lot of what led me to this work is a sense that much of the interventions, if you want to call it that, that we employ at the moment just are not deep enough. They're not
yeah,
transformative enough. And so I guess I feel hopeful if I feel that there is enough courage and appetite to act more boldly. I feel pessimistic if I feel like we are too risk averse, feeling too contained in the way that we are trying to make the world better. And, you know, just with the complexity of thinking about the systems that we inhabit, depending on what kind of lens you're taking, yeah, you can flip flop between two extremes really quite quickly, I think, or at least that's my experience.
yeah. And this is a bit spooky, because before this call, I had a call with somebody who explained that she left the diplomatic corps
Mm,
because she couldn't stand how conservatively run the whole
mm,
system was, and
right.
wouldn't either didn't encourage or didn't allow people to be courageous and bold.
Yeah.
So I think that's a fascinating tension. I wonder what card we're going to get. So
Yeah.
let's tip out some of the cards.
Okay.
And how many times would you like me to cut the deck?
6.
6. So 6 piles or 7
6
piles?
piles.
6
6
piles.
piles.
Okay. Feels like there should be a drum roll going on in the
I
background.
know.
So pile 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6?
6.
Okay. And I've got 6 cards in this pile. So which number?
Well, oh no, I don't want to go with 6 because then we're on 666. So let's go for 4.
4. Okay. So this is the value that we've
Oh,
chosen,
interesting.
value of health. And the first question is this: what does health mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Interesting. That's a really good one for that question, I think, because health, I think, can be looked at in lots of different ways, and often in our kind of mainstream culture, it's presented to us in terms of personal health. So, the power of the like fitness industry and diet culture and the growing body of or the power behind the kind of self-help industry, I think. Those are like really, really powerful forces that I think we're surrounded by all the time in terms of advertising. But I think there's like a softer element to that as well of people's experience of what they need, both physically, mentally, spiritually, to live the life that they want to live. And as well, what comes to me is something around the interconnection of the health of ourselves, our families, our communities, all the way up to sort of health of the living ecosystem of which we are a part, and perhaps how health has been often really commodified to be something that's like really individualistic. But perhaps health, actually, we're starting to see, or at least, the optimist in me wants to believe that we're starting to see a more kind of interconnected idea around health, that it's difficult for me and my loved ones and my communities to be healthy if our living planet isn't healthy, but also vice versa. How do we have like a healthy culture that allows us to appreciate and engage with and enjoy and protect the natural world as well? So that's where my kind of brain goes, and it's something that I think about fairly regularly, actually, in terms of the cultural messages that we receive around health, and how often they're squashed. Like our understanding of health is simply kind of access to a doctor, or popping some paracetamol, or getting down the gym, or whatever. Perhaps what could be, or what would be made possible if we had a slightly broader idea of health.
Yeah, so like you, I started to write down the different ways in which we might consider ourselves to be either in good health or not such good health. And so I've got physical, mental, financial, spiritual. And then, like you, it kind of spread out to there's the environment within which you exist, whether that's a neighborhood or nature or the planet.
Yeah.
And also kind of playing to what you were saying about this broader, I'm not sure if it's a definition, but broader understanding. I also wrote down balance, because you mentioned going down the gym, and I'm not so sure that the way that is all positioned is much to do anymore with health, because for a lot of
Yeah.
people, it's to do with standing in society or vanity or personal appearance and all that sort of stuff, which strikes me as kind of veering away from the whole notion of health.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So that balance thing, and also intention, because things can be driven to an end without the right intention. And that's not healthy.
Yeah.
feels like. And there's so much of that seems to go on, especially say in the political world, but also even in marketing and advertising, where people are saying one thing, but they're kind of meaning something else, or there's an ulterior motive, and that just doesn't feel healthy.
Mm.
What about the metaphors then? So what does health look like, sound like, feel like? What metaphors come to mind?
Yeah, so I immediately, what came to mind was the a really embodied metaphor that we speak about quite often at Common Cause, that I always really resonate. My colleague Elsie always says that she really sort of almost like feels like a bodily feeling when we talk about this metaphor of of like you could use the rainforest, you could talk about oceans, whatever it might be, a kind of environmental part of our ecosystem. This idea of like the rainforest as being like our lungs. There's something around I quite like metaphors that take in processes that we see in our natural world around us, and then apply that to the ways that human beings live. And health, for me, that feels like quite a powerful one, because health is something that we experience in our bodies, and being able to connect that to the kind of wider planet that we all share feels really powerful. So I love that metaphor myself. So yeah, something that, there's so many, the idea about breathing is like something so rhythmic, and how it from that leads to so much bodily function that we're kind of barely aware of. That feels really powerful to me. There's definitely something about the like in the kind of inhibition of being able to sort of like draw breath deeply and feel your lungs and stuff like that. So I'm really drawn to that, I think, as a kind of metaphor.
You just made me take a deep breath then.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, so mine, I think, is a pond. So just imagine, all of the different flora and fauna and insects and animals and birds that come to visit, and they don't do it because they're forced to do it. They do it of their own free will. They're just there. And because they are there, all of them, the whole thing is just better for it and is healthy. And the other thing that comes to mind there is something about how, and this sounds like a contradiction, I think, maybe, because in that pond environment, you've got life and death happening in a cycle, but that's fine. It's just what it is. And if you said to me before we started this conversation, oh, if you're going to talk about health, then can death be part of it? Well, in that case, yes, it absolutely is. It's just very natural. So that's my metaphor. And then I like the breathing bit, I really like, but I can't get out of my head the sound of a heartbeat. That's the other metaphor that comes to mind for health. Definitely. And this, like you say, I think it's the similarity with breathing there, this, very rhythmic, very strong, actually. So when you put your head on somebody's chest and you hear boom, boom, boom,
definitely.
like that says health.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's explore this a bit further with another question then. And let's go, I know we've just said about us being optimistic. So let's go to the other side of the darker side of the coin. Where have you noticed ill health?
I mean, you experience it. I guess there's different layers that you can experience ill health. You know, some of my most formative experiences in my life that really change the way that you see the world and the role that you have in it, etc., has often been when loved ones around me have been very unwell. And I think there's a shift there in terms of your priority, the space that you give to relationships, etc., when you are faced with the prospect of not having loved ones kind of near you anymore. That's definitely, you know, that's things that shape you and that you consider, you know, long after that situation was kind of really current. So I definitely think that, I mean, you can't, or at least my brain immediately goes to the cultural experience of the pandemic as well, like that sense of ill health in so many different ways, in you know, the fear that you had of being ill yourself or loved ones being ill and you couldn't get to them, the sense of ill health at the scale that we were looking at in terms of, you know, will we structurally, will we be able to provide for everybody who might be experiencing ill health at that scale. But I think it also really shined a light on the health of our nation and the sort of it shone a light on maybe some of the really deep social cracks we have kind of in our social fabric that perhaps for a moment made us stop and think, oh, is this a healthy society? And I don't mean necessarily health in terms of your body or your mentality, but about what we would consider an effective, well-running, caring, equitable kind of community. So yeah, that's when I think about my experiences of ill health, I can think about stuff in my personal life that has really shaped how I, you know, view relationships and how I view my kind of position and the fragility, I suppose, of life, as well as then thinking about recent experiences that we've had as like a global family in terms of the coronavirus.
I know. I guess not many people would be able to not think of the pandemic when asked that question, right? And I think it's fascinating to think about the pandemic because, you know, you've got this, well, just the biggest thing that's ever happened from an ill health point of view. I'm fortunate because I didn't know anybody personally that suffered as a result or died as a result. But I do know people that found it really difficult. And what comes to mind for me about the pandemic is how it feels like we have said that it's over at a very superficial level. And we don't seem to have paid as much attention as I think we could have done to the follow-on that is, it feels like there is follow-on there. And I think the school setting is probably the easiest one to look at there, where just because children are back at school, some people seem to think that that's it, they're back at school, so that's it. Whereas I was speaking to somebody in education, it's probably about a month ago now, and they were saying that when they visit, this is younger children, they were talking about the two age groups were 5 and 8, I think. And they were saying that previously, when they had been visiting 8-year-olds, they would sit on a chair to communicate with the 8-year-old. And they were saying that since the pandemic, they're actually finding that the children are more comfortable on the floor rather than on a chair, which is how they used to treat younger children. And so basically they were saying that there has been a setback, and it feels like that's just not being acknowledged because we're taking a very literal view of they're back in the building, they're back in school.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other, right at the other end of that scale, then, so that's kind of like macro and society. I'm just planning to travel to go to a funeral this week,
Mm.
and it's my eldest daughter's partner's mum.
Right.
It's reminded me of when my mum was very ill before she died. So she had motor neuron disease, and she survived for about 18 months from diagnosis to the time she died.
Mm.
And I think my memory of that is how I couldn't really cope with it very well,
Mm.
because it just felt like the disease had taken my mum away from me.
Yeah.
I remember when she eventually died, just thinking, that's good,
Mm.
because it's the end now, and it wasn't my mum anymore anyway.
Yeah.
So, but that sounds really cold, doesn't it? It's like,
I think there's something about so my dad passed away nearly 7 years ago now, from cancer, and again a very sort of quick from diagnosis to death. And there is very understandably such a focus on the deteriorating health of the loved one, but there is this sense of relief, I think, because it is such an exhausting state to be in as like the person who is going through the loss, seeing the loss of someone that you care about so deeply. It is impossible to sustain for a very long period of time that level of emotion, I think, like that kind of feeling of grief and worry and concern and anxiety and loss and everything. Like they're really big feelings that I think are really difficult to kind of just sit with for long periods of time. And I found myself, when my dad passed away, also feeling that sense of, like, it's not because of in any way wanting him to
yeah,
be gone, but just this sense of like, we've come, this is the crossroads. This is where we have been going for a long time, and we've reached the destination, and maybe things can settle a bit. And it does sound really cold, I think, if you haven't been through that experience yourself. But it's, yeah, that we don't necessarily think about the kind of the ripple effect of the health of everyone else also kind of within that situation, and it's really difficult.
yeah, because my stepdad had to care for her, obviously, in that time, and it must be utterly draining. I remember seeing a TV program about a guy whose wife had dementia,
Mm.
and I think it was on the news, and they kept in touch with him over a period of years, and he was just dead on his feet. It was
Yeah.
just completely exhausting. So I think that's a really good point that you just made there, that ill health might seem to be like an individual, but
Mm.
there is absolutely this ripple, is a great way to describe it, affecting everybody in their environment, which
Mm.
I don't know that it's actually considered that much, because all of the, like you say, the focus is on the person.
Yeah, 100%. We're very binary in our thinking, I often feel, in our culture, we're this or we're that, you're
Yeah,
healthy or you're ill. Um, and it misses so much complexity and nuance that's present in our actual realities. So it's difficult really and I think, it's mirrored in what we've just been saying about the pandemic. We were in the pandemic and now we are not. And we miss actually all of this kind of additional like grey matter that we could actually be using and being really insightful, and it would help us to design our societies in ways that are actually more helpful and like beneficial and kind to people, but we tend to ignore it, which I think is a real shame. And maybe that's human nature and our kind of desire for simplicity and order in chaos. I'm not sure, but I often wish we were able to stop and think and spend more time in that like messy middle.
I absolutely agree. And it's funny you mention, is it human nature? Because I was going to ask you, because it does seem to me that, like you say, we crave black or white. And I just wonder whether that's because we feel a greater sense of control then, because we know what is and what isn't, that kind of thing. Whereas if we invite people into the grey, does that need an approach that is more giving and more, I don't understand everything, and more vulnerable, and people maybe feel under pressure that they shouldn't be vulnerable, they should be strong, they must know everything, and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so whilst we've just said, yes, society tends to be quite binary, well, let's do that. Let's go from ill health. So the next question is, when have you experienced health?
Yeah, that's hard. I almost think that's harder, because you don't clock moments of when you're feeling really either physically or mentally well. I tend to think that you're much more present in those times. So I don't know. And I suppose as well, as you get older and everything starts like creaking and aching a bit more, you're maybe more likely to add to your list of complaints than you are to celebrate your health. But I do think there are like times when you've had some issue. So I've had COVID a couple of times, and that loss of sense of taste and smell was horrible, was really, really awful. And that I really appreciated when it came back. And I remember trying to be like, you need to, this has to be something that you don't take for granted, etc. And obviously you do. Life is busy, and you have 1,001 things to be thinking about, and you don't carve out the time to be thinking, oh, how brilliant does this apple taste, and I can smell things, and you just don't do it. But often you notice, I think, like the health part when it's gone. Or I find when I've done something that feels like you've carved out time to maybe go at a bit of a slower pace. So my partner and I, we stayed in Henley on Thames a few weeks ago, and we took this lovely walk, like 10-mile walk from Henley to Marlow. And it's beautiful, really lovely to be out in the countryside, and there wasn't that many people, and it felt really idyllic. But I also love that feeling of like your body's feeling a bit achy at the end of it, and you feel like you've really you've put your body into motion, which is so often it's difficult to find the time and the inclination to kind of go and do that sort of stuff. So I like that feeling of remembering, I suppose, like what your body can do, and that you appreciate it, that it can like take you off on adventures and to see things and stuff. So yeah, that's probably what I would say.
Yeah, I love what you said then about you take it for granted, and you only notice it when it's taken away. And I think the pandemic really heightened people's awareness of their health.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what how long that continues for, because again, like you said, you might have been savoring that apple when you got your taste and smell back, but for how long was it until it was like, oh, here's another apple? And
exactly. Yeah.
So of health, it's when I was probably around early 20s, and I had a summer holiday job in Eastbourne, and it was in a hotel, so we had to work split shift. So we had the afternoon off between 2 and 6, and this was during summer holiday. And so we used to go and play football. And I remember the first time we played, just, after 10 minutes, totally out of breath, totally not being able to do anything. But then after, it was a short period of time, I think it was probably after about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, you could then just play all afternoon and it was fine. And you didn't have to think about it. So, and I don't remember thinking I'm aching at the end of it. And I agree with you again that tiredness through exertion is a really great feeling.
Yeah.
But I don't remember that part of it. I just remember feeling a bit like a machine. It was like I can keep going. I can do this.
Yeah.
So that's a time for me. Now, on the ValuesJam cards, there's an opportunity for you to create your own question. So let's do that. Ask your own question about health, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how.
I think my immediate, what comes to mind, I think links back to what I mentioned in my answer to the first question around definitions, that I feel like there's this incredible opportunity to almost alter slightly the way that we understand health, especially in kind of Western nations. So my question would almost be something like what could we learn from different cultural ways of living and knowing, being in the world about health. So I know that there is so much kind of wisdom that's shared often from members of Indigenous communities and cultures that I think actually just have a really, really different understanding of health and have a much broader connection of human health with ecological health. And I wonder if that were to be explored and brought more into the forefront of our cultural thinking, whether that would have an impact on the way that we see ourselves in connection to the kind of wider living ecosystem of which we're a part, and what that would do to our how we act as participants kind of within the world, but what it would do to our own understandings of human health, and how how would we design the NHS differently if we had a really different understanding of health. So that would be my question, and I think that would be fascinating to learn more about.
So you mentioned at least 2 questions there. So that one was what could we learn from others. The other one was how would we design the NHS if. So which one shall we play with?
I think maybe the second one. It's nice to have some tangibility. So the NHS feels like it's in crisis and has been for a seemingly long time, kind of potentially getting worse. And I think crises are often really awful, but they also often give us an opportunity to rethink or reflect and redesign. And I wonder whether if we had a different idea of health, whether we would create a different system to explore health or protect health or whatever we might define it as.
So have you got some first thoughts, or would you rather me just give some thoughts?
Why don't you give some thoughts on that question just generally, I suppose, and then I can add if
okay. So for the NHS, I think there's something about focusing on health rather than sickness.
Interesting.
So, the NHS system seems to be designed to correct people, whereas if it was designed to keep people healthy in the first place, then that might be interesting. And in the values space, I wonder what difference it would make if we were all educated to be more aware of what our values are and then to put them into practice, which it just feels like it would mean that a lot less people would be suffering from feeling out of sorts at, kind of the lower end of the scale to becoming very ill at the higher end of the scale because they're constantly at odds with what is true to them. Um, and then there's something, and again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about our desire perhaps for simplicity. It feels like we don't really understand the complexity of what health is about. We're more content to say, if your body's working, you're healthy. But actually and you use the word, when you're talking about other cultures and stuff, talked about being. So indigenous people, for instance, and I've not got any kind of detailed knowledge of this, but from what I understand and people that I've met, they just seem so much more at peace with what is, rather than the kind of Western civilization stereotype, which is like always striving for something.
Yeah.
And for what? So those are my two thoughts. One, so the NHS focus it on health rather than on correcting sickness. And then secondly, have a much deeper, broader understanding of what health actually is.
Yeah. I suppose I really like that sense of, although we call it our kind of National Health Service, there is a lot of firefighting. It's not preventative necessarily. It's firefighting, and I guess that can be due to lots of reasons. One of them being that we're actually not very versed in health necessarily. We don't necessarily have a great deal of understanding about how to live healthy lives, which is obviously so personalized for each person. And also we've kind of created a society that's very overly, I would say overly focused on this sense of being a productive kind of citizen, to the point where we have a huge stress and sort of depression epidemic, I would say, that people can't do the things that actually brings them joy and meaning and purpose in their life, and that I would believe gives them not just mental well-being, but that translates through into your physical health. So yeah, there's definitely stuff around that you can't design a national health service in a culture that also isn't believing the same things, isn't built on those same values of actually it's people above profit and growth. Growth, just never-ending growth, is not the answer to a good life. I suppose so an example we use at Common Cause quite a lot of the kind of the experiences we have as people just alive today in the world, and how that experiences embody values for us. My experience of being able to go to a doctor in the UK and experience free healthcare at the point of need. I'm fortunate as a British citizen to be able to have that. Obviously, not everybody who lives in the UK is given that right, which is wrong, but it's different to how I would feel and experience the health service if I was a US citizen or a citizen of another nation where it's a kind of paid for health service. So I wonder, there's something really interesting to me about the ways that we design our systems and the kind of narratives that undersit them. And there are many harmful narratives in the UK, but I do believe that the NHS was set up on this idea that everybody deserves
Yeah.
needs good health service, and I believe that to still be the case today. And so how kind of, what are the like value foundations of these big systems that we all interact with so often, on a weekly basis for some people. That feels really important to me, and like having a really like what would a public discussion look like on that? Like what would come about from the UK public being able to think about that really openly together? And yeah, that kind of excites me as a possibility.
Mm. And I'm intrigued by this preventative versus correct, because the economics of that probably are that preventative is the best thing to do.
I would imagine so, yeah.
So why don't we do more of that? And is it because it's money today rather than tomorrow, and it's as simple as that. But it's like, why is it that we service our car every year, but we don't service ourselves every year?
Yeah. I very, very often think about how I'd love to have a kind of human body MOT. Like
Yeah,
how you could just go in once a year, check everything's, ticking along. I think it would give you peace of mind in a way that
definitely.
we don't have necessarily at the moment, and people worry about, oh well, if I'm ill I'm gonna have to take time off work and I'll only be paid for a certain amount of time. And I think it would help us to feel more secure. But yeah, I don't know how much of it is that um the investment, the upfront investment, I suppose, in more preventative measures is feels very um very large, and you can't immediately see the benefits of it.
Yeah. But so just that example, let's just play with that for an instant, right? So imagine that it was to be decided that there would be a human MOT every year.
Mhm.
And this would not be very different than your car. You just plug it in, it tells you the diagnostic, and then
Mm.
you deal with any of the things that have to be dealt with. What you could do is make that a cost of employment. So the employer pays for that. And why wouldn't they? Because
Mm.
they're benefiting from the person that works for them. And then the state just picks up, the people that are not covered by those that are employed.
Mm.
So that seems quite reasonable, and it's a small
Mhm.
amount of money, right? It's just anyway.
Yeah, I suppose, like, often things aren't very easily diagnosable. These symptoms could be symptoms of numerous ailments that you then have to sort of work out. So maybe the follow-up of any MOT could be costly, but um yeah, I'd be surprised if that's not a feature of health services in some countries. I wouldn't, I'm completely guessing, but I can imagine that that's something, we do flu jabs and things like that.
Yeah.
There is there is systems there for kind of wide scale yearly.
Mhm. Just imagine how AI could support that.
Yeah, too. Yeah, very much so. I wonder whether there'd be appetite. I don't know. I always think it would be really useful. Every time I have a twinge, I think, oh, if I just had like a yearly appointment where I could just go and have the once over.
So we've got two votes for it.
Yeah, I'd vote for it for sure.
Excuse me. That's quite funny having a cough, isn't it, to talk about.
See, need the MOT.
So let's bring this values jam to a close with the final question then, and that's this: what are you encouraged to do differently about health as a result of our conversation?
Interesting. Well, apart from starting a petition for a human MOT, maybe and I try to do this, but I do find it difficult, to be more reflective of my own assessments of health, kind of um, how influenced I can be by some of the kind of very mainstream ideas of you know, you need to just buy this latest, I don't know, pill or whatever the Kardashians are advertising now to, you know, to transform your wellness and your well-being for the better, and try to tap in more to those times when your body feels good, when it's feeling at its most like alive. And yeah, I'm going to continue thinking about that thread, I guess, between human, individual or community health, all the way up to like the health of our living planet. I feel like that needs exploring more and advocating more. Yeah, that'd be mine. What about you?
I've got two. One is I'm thinking more about a sense of well-being being more important than health. So I'm not going to beat myself up for not going to the gym, and all of those things. And I've got to be careful here, actually, because I suppose it would be easy to use that as an excuse for not going. So I've left myself open there, haven't I? So there's that.
Tapping into intention, like you said, you know, are you going because you want to be able to say that you went, or are you going because you feel like your body feels able and like it would be enjoyable to move and exercise, you know?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because what I'm going to do is remember that feeling of that summer holiday when I could just play football all afternoon. But it was it wasn't health per se, it was that feeling of well-being that was more important. So it's that coming first, and maybe the exercise being the way to achieve that, rather than the exercise being there to achieve health. So that's the first one. And then the second one, I really enjoyed what you were saying about that achy feeling. And I'm just going to think about how this sounds a bit crazy, but at the back of our garden, we've got like a vegetable plot, and virtually nothing has grown there. And a gardener said, well, you know, it's just typical Southeast London soil. That's why nothing will grow in it. So you need to dig in a lot of manure and compost and stuff like that. So I did a couple of weekends ago. And I also have got a sieve where you can shovel the earth into it, and then the earth comes through and you're left with the stones, like loads of them.
Right.
So I'm going to make that a project that I'm going to, because it's quite to do this sieve thing is quite strenuous. And after I'd done it, it was like, whoa. So I think I'm going to do that regularly. How regularly, don't know. And I'm going to work that out. So yeah, you use my sieve in the vegetable plot.
Yeah. And that's a good way to be reminded about, you know, the complexity of our own bodies and the way that they move and the way that they're connected, and then, you know, how we interact with that natural world around us. It's a good way to link the two.
All right, Ruth, that's been brilliant. Thank you so much for having a values jam, and great that we chose the card of health. I'm not sure either of us would have guessed that would be the one that came up, but it was good fun and really insightful as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was super interesting.
All right, take care.